Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. I'd like to welcome you, dear viewers, to another in our series, Understanding the Qur'an. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May Allah's peace and blessings be on each and every one of you. As we mentioned earlier, we're looking at the 27th verse. And we had found our way basically to the halfway point. We almost completed it. But in order to look at the remainder, we need to look at that verse again. I will read it to you now. That verse, 27th, says,
ثم قفينا على آثارهم برسلنا وقفينا بعيسى ابن مريم وآتيناه الإنجيل وجعلنا في قلوب الذين اتبعوه رأفة ورحمة ورهبانية ابتدعوها ما كتبناها عليهم إلا ابتغاء رضوان الله فما رعوها حق رعايتها فآتينا الذين آمنوا منهم أجرهم وكثير منهم فاسقون.
Then I sent after them my messengers, following their footsteps. And after them I sent Jesus, son of Mary, and gave him the gospel. And I placed in the hearts of those who followed him compassion and mercy. But I did not prescribe for them the monasticism that they invented for themselves. Though they sought to please Allah with it, they did not observe it correctly. So I rewarded those among them who believed, and many of them were rebellious. So this verse continues on from the verse previous, wherein Allah spoke about Prophet Noah and Abraham, that he sent them as prophets and messengers carrying the scripture, and that many of their descendants were also prophets carrying scriptures, and that many of those who were their people who should have followed them disobeyed them defiantly, and few among them were also guided. And after them, all of them, the last now was Prophet Isa, or Prophet Jesus, the son of Mary. And Allah sent with him the gospel. And specifically is mentioned here the gospel. But we should not mix up the gospel here with the gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's written there, the gospel according to St. Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John. These are not the Gospels of Jesus. These are the Gospels written by individuals whose names we don't even know. Though it says Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Christian scholars of the Scripture are unanimous in pointing out that these names do not refer to disciples of Jesus who had similar names. They're referring to other people. These are names which are stuck on the Gospels to give them a kind of legitimacy, because they're writing things about Jesus, and for people to accept them, there needed to be some connection. So the names of some of the apostles, some of the disciples of Jesus, were placed on these Gospels. But the Gospels themselves, when you put them together, they contradict each other, they describe things in different ways. There are many, many, many contradictions among them. Things are found in one, not found in another, etc. And they represent, even what is available now in the Bible, only a fraction of the actual documents that are available to Christian scholars. They say more than 5,000 documents exist, from the Gospels. More than 5,000. No two of them agreeing with each other. So they have a task. There are some people trying to piece together the actual gospel. It is something impossible. Furthermore, the Jesus Seminary that has studied the gospel, they have identified that the fraction of what is in the gospels which may be accurately attributed to Jesus is only a minuscule amount. From the Lord's Prayer, the most famous prayer of Christians today, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, etc., etc. This prayer, which every Christian learns, and he says it every day before going to bed at night or whatever. This prayer, the Jesus Seminary, a group mixed up, made of theologians from all of the major sects, Catholic theologians, Protestant theologians, from the various different groups, or studying the Gospels in detail, they have concluded that the only part of the Lord's Prayer that can be accurately attributed to Jesus is Our Father. The rest of it was made up. So, when you find yourself in a situation like this, what can you say of these Gospels? They're obviously not reliable sources of the message which Jesus brought. Of course, Christians have said, so where is his gospel? Where is Jesus' gospel? If he actually had a gospel. No. His gospel is just the spirit of the message, the gospel of love. We have different explanations given. No, he was given a scripture. The fact that the scripture is lost today doesn't deny or doesn't change the reality that he did receive a scripture. Other prophets before received scriptures. Can we say that the scriptures that are around today are the scriptures which they received? With all the distortions that exist there, we say, no, these things have been distorted, and there is no difference. So they said, then where did it go to? The kind of gospel which we're implying, they call it a sayings gospel, where Jesus is himself narrating things from God, or he's making statements himself. He said, we don't have this tradition amongst the Gospels at all. Well, recently they found in Nag Hammadi in Egypt, in some old manuscripts, they did find what could be classed as a sayings gospel, the Gospel of Timothy. Now, the issues of its authenticity and that, the scholars are, of different opinions about, but, it is very old, way back to the 3rd century, and it is in that pattern. It's unusual amongst the various gospels and apocryphal gospels that are around, which tend to be a biography of Jesus' life. And of course, obviously that's not the gospel. Just as you look at the Qur'an, or you look at the Torah, the actual essence part of the Torah is not a story. It's not a story of the life of the prophet. It may contain stories of the lives of prophets, but it's not a story of the life of the prophet. What you find, the Qur'an, the tradition of the Qur'an, you see, it is, you could call it a sayings scripture, where God is making this statement, God is making another statement, and you find in it some stories, parables, etc., to clarify points. That pattern, similar pattern, can be found in the Gospel of Timothy. Now, the Jesus Seminary has put this out in a book called The 5 Gospels, in which they mention the 4, identifying what of it could accurately be attributed to Jesus, and they bring out for the general public for the first time the Gospel of Timothy, which is, as we refer to as a sayings gospel. But of course, its authenticity, as I said, is not 100%. They do feel very confident about it. But the point of the matter here is that the gospel of Jesus is not what people have in their hands and commonly, quote from. And when Muslims say, yes, we believe in the gospel, it doesn't mean we believe in those gospels, because those are the gospels according to individuals who are of unknown origin, as we said before, and that is according to Christian scholarship itself, not even Muslims saying it's unknown. No, Christian scholars themselves say that we don't know who wrote the gospels. Along with the various contradictions which exist among them, we have enough of a situation there where we cannot attribute this to Jesus accurately. Then Allah goes on to talk about monasticism, which we spoke about previously, that it is something invented by people. This is not from Islam. Islam discourages the idea of a person going off, in the top of a mountain and worshiping God by himself there, because the states that he reaches are artificial. When you throw him amongst the people, he falls apart. This is why the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, had said, the believer who mixes with the people and bears their harm is better than the believer who doesn't mix with the people and bear their harm. So Islam encourages, development and strength of faith within the thick of the struggle of life. We also have a statement from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ with regards to monasticism, where in which he said, every prophet, this was narrated by Anas ibn Malik, every prophet has monasticism, jihad in the cause of Allah, the exalted, the most honored, is the monasticism of this ummah. This is monasticism in the sense that a person dedicates himself to God. He has left aside his worldly affairs and dedicated himself. Here is that dedication in the course of jihad. There's another narration from the Prophet ﷺ in which he made a similar statement, where Abu Sa'id al-Khudri said that a man had come to the Prophet ﷺ and asked him for advice, and the Prophet ﷺ had said, I advise you to adhere to the fear of Allah, because it is the chief of all matters. Fulfill the obligation of jihad, because it is monasticism. It is the monasticism of Islam. Take care of remembering Allah and reciting the Qur'an, because it is your closeness or status in the heavens and your good fame on earth. Okay, so in this narration, as well as the previous one, jihad is referred to as the Islamic monasticism. And this, of course, ultimately existed for all of the prophets before. That element existed because the idea of struggling in defense of the faith, we find it necessary in the course of the lives of all of the prophets. Where they had followers, they were obliged at different points in time to fight in defense of the faith.
For understanding Qur'an, we have to know how many words are there. If we want to understand the Qur'an, we have to understand 78,000 words. In each line of the Qur'an, 9 words are there. 125 frequently occurring words that come in the Qur'an 40,000 times. Every 10th word of the Qur'an is from Surah Al Fatiha.
Soothing compilation.
When we open the Qur'an, immediately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts talking to us.
Direct communication.
Our relationship with the Qur'an is direct, personal, planned, and relevant. You're saying it, you're showing it, you're thinking about it, you're listening, you're watching the words, and that's the way to go.
Let's comprehend the pure words that came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Let's Understand the Quran. Every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 5 p.m. Saudi Arabia and 6 p.m. UAE on Peace TV. Courage it takes to stand up for what you believe in. Courage it takes to be true and righteous. Courage it takes to dare and answer your questions, be they social, political, economic, educational, or religious. To get clear and convincing answers,
test your courage and question me in Dare to Ask.
Dare to Ask, next on Peace TV.
Along with the various contradictions which exist among them, we have enough of a situation there where we cannot attribute this to Jesus accurately. Then Allah goes on to talk about monasticism, which we spoke about previously, that it is something invented by people. This is not from Islam. Islam discourages the idea of a person going off, in the top of a mountain and worshiping God by himself there, because the states that he reaches are artificial. When you throw him amongst the people, he falls apart. This is why the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, had said, the believer who mixes with the people and bears their harm is better than the believer who doesn't mix with the people and bear their harm. So Islam encourages, development and strength of faith within the thick of the struggle of life. We also have a statement from the Prophet ﷺ with regards to monasticism, in which he said, every prophet, this was narrated by Anas ibn Malik, every prophet has monasticism, jihad in the cause of Allah, the exalted, the most honored, is the monasticism of this ummah. This is monasticism in the sense that a person dedicates himself to God. He has left aside his worldly affairs and dedicated himself. Here is that dedication in the course of jihad. There's another narration from the Prophet ﷺ in which he made a similar statement, where Abu Sa'id al-Khudri said that a man had come to the Prophet ﷺ and asked him for advice, and the Prophet ﷺ had said, I advise you to adhere to the fear of Allah, because it is the chief of all matters. Fulfill the obligation of jihad, because it is monasticism. It is the monasticism of Islam. Take care of remembering Allah and reciting the Qur'an, because it is your closeness or status in the heavens and your good fame on earth. Okay, so in this narration, as well as the previous one, jihad is referred to as the Islamic monasticism. And this, of course, ultimately existed for all of the prophets before. That element existed because the idea of struggling in defense of the faith, we find it necessary in the course of the lives of all of the prophets. Where they had followers, they were obliged at different points in time to fight in defense of the faith, because the forces of evil will not let them rest. It will strive to destroy them, to remove them. So there has to be a struggle, a physical struggle which the believers have to undertake in defense of the faith. Then Allah goes on to say, after saying that they didn't observe their monasticism correctly anyway, He went on to say, so I rewarded those among them who believed, but many of them were rebellious. Those among the believers who were followers of the previous prophets, Allah promises reward for them. We find a statement of the Prophet narrated by Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, in which he said, 3 will get their reward twice. A believer from the people of the scriptures who has been a true believer in his prophet and then believes in me will get a double reward. A slave who fulfills Allah's rights and obligations as well as the duties of his master will get a double reward. A person who has a slave girl and he educates her properly, teaches her good manners properly, without violence, and then manumits her and marries her will get a double reward. So we find in this statement of the Prophet ﷺ, the promise of a double reward for those who were true followers of the prophets. Now people today who, though they have been raised in Christian tradition and they have studied the scriptures and come to the conclusion that Jesus really was not God, and they strive to worship God alone, and they reject these false beliefs which have been introduced into Christianity, and then they find Islam and they accept Islam, then Allah doubles their reward. It's very important, because a lot of people, when they become Muslims, when they look back in their past and they see so much of their life was spent, in the Christian teachings or whatever, and they realize that actually they were not on the correct path, and they feel a lot of regret. But the thing is that Allah has promised here, if they were sincere in their search for the truth, that those efforts which were made will not be lost, because Allah rewards all sincere efforts to worship Him. He rewards it. But of course, sincerity, must be based on knowledge. Because you can be sincerely evil, you can be sincerely misguided, you can be sincerely corrupt. You can be sincere in whatever you're doing, but it only becomes rewarded where you have sought the truth, you've sought out the truth, and having found what you could of it, you try to follow it sincerely. This is the case where the person earns for himself a double reward. And of course, we need to consider what the Prophet ﷺ also said, that a slave who fulfills the rights of his master, and he fulfills Allah's rights first, such an individual will get double the reward. So, people where slavery may exist in Islam, in the sense that Islam has permitted it, those sought to abolish it and to remove it through legitimate channels, effective channels. The reality is that the Prophet ﷺ always stressed that the person who is in that position of servitude should not even be referred to as a slave. He should not be called my slave. Right? This is not permissible. The Prophet ﷺ forbade it. He said to call the person my young man, my man, not my slave. So even that name and the implications of the name were forbidden in Islam. But the Prophet ﷺ points out that a person who is in that position of servitude, such a person who fulfills Allah's rights. He worships Allah as Allah has prescribed for him, given his circumstance. And at the same time, he fulfills his duty to his master, the one who is put in charge over him. He does the right thing. He does whatever he's been instructed to do, fairly and honestly. Such a person will get double the reward. They're not denied anything. They've not lost anything in the end. It's a trial to be in that position. But ultimately, we can see in the history of Islam, many of the leading scholars from the first generations, they were freed slaves. They were former slaves. There are so many of the major narrators of hadith, etc., they were former slaves, and their masters freed them, and they became leading scholars of Islam. So Islam does not have any stigma, does not have any negative attitude towards a person due to his or her background. And the slavery, which was permitted according to Islamic law, was so modified, really it no longer resembled what was known as slavery in other societies. They only shared a common name, but the reality is that it was quite different. There were so many different laws protecting the rights of those in the position of servitude that, it made them virtually another citizen in society. Their masters were obliged to fulfill certain responsibilities for them, and they were not allowed free access in the sense that they could use them and beat them and harm them and mutilate them and do anything they wished to them, because they were not their property in that sense. Human beings belong ultimately only to Allah. With that, dear viewers, I'd like to thank you for being with us in this segment of our program, Understanding the Qur'an, in which we have been looking at Surah Al Hadeed. We're right at the very end, finishing off the last verses, the verse 27 in particular, and there remains another 2 verses, verses 28 and 29, to finish off the chapter, and this we will do in our coming segments, inshallah. May Allah's peace and blessings be on all of you, and we hope to see you in our coming segments. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.